In today's lecture topic, we're going to be looking at one of the most basic of design elements, which is lines. Lines are one of the most basic and useful elements as designers to not just frame and add interest to our content, but also divide layouts into interesting pieces and guide the viewer's eye throughout a design. So let's start looking at some examples of line as a design element, how it is used, and why it is important to us as graphic designers. First, let's define a line. Mathematically, a line is a point set in motion. It is the first of the three dimensions. So if we take a point and we move that point across space, the path that the point makes across space creates a line. Then, of course, if we move the line itself, we create a plane. Points, lines, and planes, or contours, are three of the most basic ways to show shape, volume, and perspective in any kind of layout. Here's a great picture that shows the idea of a point being set in motion, creating a line. This is a very famous photo of Pablo Picasso, and in this picture he's literally painting with light. He's painting with a light bulb or a flashlight in midair, and it is being captured by an open shutter. And if you guys want to look more into Picasso's work, he did a lot of these very interesting paintings where he painted things right in the air very, very quickly, and creating some very interesting pieces of art, design, photography, all three at the same time that are just very memorable and really show the concept of lines being a point moving in space. So lines are very important also because they can convey feelings and they can convey moods, depending on the way they're shaped. For example, if I wanted to show something that looks nervous, I could do maybe some very short, quick, and very sharp lines. If I wanted to show something that was peaceful, perhaps it would be very long and fluid and flowing lines with lots of space, etc., etc., etc. So line, movement creates lines, and one of the most basic things about lines is that our eyes follow the line. So as designers, we can literally decide where and when the viewer sees objects on a layout depending on how we use lines. Lines are also the contour of a shape. So by enclosing a line or shaping a line in a certain way, we can imply shape, then we can start describing objects and forms. And if we look throughout the history of art, some of the greatest pieces ever done were simply with lines. So it's not really, the quality of a piece of art or design doesn't really depend on how complex it is, but how well it communicates, and sometimes with very, very little, in a very economical way, you can convey and communicate a whole lot of information. A very interesting artist that I recommend that you look into is Alexander Calder. And Alexander Calder was famous for doing portraits of people live on the spot with nothing but wire and pliers. And so he would come in front of you, take out his wire, and start bending it and cutting it with the pliers and create a portrait that captured the person's essence just with a line of wire, which is quite an incredible thing to see. Lines also describe forms in the form of contours. And as we can see from these visual examples here, contours can describe the shape of an object, whether it be rocks or the trees on the right, or if we think about contour maps, topographical maps, which describe the shape of topography. We can divide lines into several distinct types. If we look at these three examples here, on the top we see an actual line. In the middle we see an implied line because through the Gestalt, our mind connects all the points as one line. And in the final example we have what's called a psychic line, in which the line happens in our minds, it happens in our brain. So those are the three types of line: actual lines, implied lines, and psychic lines. And all three of them are equally as important and equally as powerful in the viewer's response to a design or a piece of art. So in the world of fine art, the gaze of a subject in a portrait or a photograph creates a psychic line. So our lines tend to go from the person's eye, and they will follow the direction of their gaze. And if we look at a lot of very incredible and interesting pieces of fine art, we see that the artist created it in a certain unique way, in which they are literally manipulating the way we, the order and the direction in which we gaze at the composition. Lines with different directions have different flavors as well. So when we have horizontal lines, they have a sense of stability, of being at rest, of being quiet, of being peaceful. Then we go into vertical lines. Vertical lines imply strength, action potential. Diagonal lines will imply motion, action, and body movement. And this is why the format for a picture or a piece of art has an influence on how it's seen. So if you have a camera, whether you take that photo horizontally or vertically, there will be a different flavor or a different influence in the viewer depending on which you use. Here's an example of a painting with very strong diagonal lines, and it's the diagonal lines which provide really that sense of movement. If the lines were more vertical or horizontal, it would not have that sense of movement. When we're drawing, we can draw in two different ways and use lines in different ways. So the first one will be the contour line, which defines the outside of a subject, or in other words, defines the positive from the negative, the foreground from the background. And a second way in which we can use lines in drawing is the gesture. Most drawings, of course, are going to be a combination of several different styles all coming into one place. So line can have different qualities, and it can be used in a wide variety of different ways. Lines can be used to demonstrate and show volume, or in other words, give something a feeling of 3 dimensions. And the line quality itself will have an influence as well. Lines can also have a very strong influence on mood, not just on their shape as well, but on things like how rough or how smooth they are, whether they are thick or heavy, whether they vary in thickness, in movement or direction. There are many, many possibilities. Lines can also be created and used in art to add value. So if we see in this composition in the background, the cartoonist or the artist is using lines to create a gradient that goes from white, then the lines appear and start increasing and increasing in density, creating a sense of grays and darker grays until we get to fully black. So here, even though it's just black and white because the ink is pure black, the artist is being able to create different shades of blacks and grays and whites depending on the density used. This is very similar to a method called cross-hatching, in which basically lines are crisscrossed and used to create all sorts of tonal ranges and shading, and that gives things a very strong 3-dimensional quality to them. We see the same thing being used in fabrics and textures, in wallpapers, in patterns, in decorative elements, and it really is everywhere. So we could really say that lines are the most important and widespread visual element in design. Here we have again examples of line in painting being used to create the outline of the forms. And the interesting thing about lines is that their shape and their mood can be used and should be used to match it to whatever theme we're creating. Here we have a very interesting piece of art by Roy Lichtenstein. Of course, when we add color to lines, and we're using a whole new other dimension that we're going to be talking about more in future lectures. Combining line with contour and lighting. Here's a very beautiful piece by Caravaggio. And then we have what can be called inherent lines, in which a composition can be divided into different sections, golden means, etc., through the layout and placement of different items within the composition.